I'm very excited to do this lecture on fascism. I shouldn't be excited probably because that makes no sense, but I'm excited for various reasons. The first one is that I worked really hard on it, but the second one is that I think that fascism continues to play a very important role in the world today, and we sometimes fail to recognize it. Sometimes we say things like Donald Trump is a fascist, or we'll say things like Boris Johnson is a fascist, or we'll say things like Le Pen is a fascist, or we'll say things like Khadim Hussain Rizvi is a fascist. And we tend to think that maybe fascism is something that is out of date, maybe it's purely a European phenomena, maybe it doesn't really exist. Sure, it came about, it destroyed millions and millions of lives, 50 million lives in World War II, etc. But now it's old news, it's done and it's over with. Whereas other people continue to think that fascism is very much here with us. The debate nonetheless is there, correct? And the term fascism is often thrown around quite loosely against one's opponents. For example, if you pick up the term fascism, you often think that it means something to the extent that if somebody is really forcing you to do something, your parents are really saying, no, you must study. Then you'll retort back and you say, Dad, you're a fascist, or something like that, right? So we tend to view fascism as naked authoritarianism and nothing other than that. Well, first of all, I want to break that impression. The misconceptions about fascism are that it's a mindless, brainless, violent, uncultured, and criminal political movement, correct? And the sort of, if you watch something like Inglourious Bastards or whatever, one of these movies or the Hollywood version of fascism, you end up thinking about fascism as being, how should one put it, based purely on brute force. And although that's partially true, what that neglects to add is that at the time in Europe, fascism was in fact a hugely, massively popular movement. This is a very famous jalsa that the fascists held in Germany on Thanksgiving Day, and that is approximately over 700,000 people in that particular jalsa. You can see it's massive. Of course, in Pakistan, you'd say this is not massive because in Pakistan, if we have 20,000 people, we say there's 2 million, right? We often exaggerate our numbers enormously. And you're probably looking at this picture and you're saying that's a lot more than 7 lakh people. But we tend to exaggerate the size of our rallies. And that probably is something of that sort. The second interesting thing is that fascists actually were not uncultured in the way that we perhaps think of, or sometimes we think of them as being totally uncultured. In fact, they appreciated art, and Hitler himself was and this may shock you, but he was really an artist. He loved to paint and so on. Now it's going to sound a lot like I am being very favorable towards fascism here, but that's not my intent at all. I think the reason I'm emphasizing what they are not is that in the way that we have depicted them, in many instances, it becomes very hard to recognize fascism when it does confront us in the modern world, in modern times, precisely because we have a picture of them which is not altogether accurate. This is a very famous painting, Water Lilies, by a Nazi painter. And you can see, I mean, it's a good work of art. There's no doubt about it. It's not something that you'd say, oh, it's just rubbish or whatnot. Similarly, through the late 1920s and the early 1930s, the Nazis gathered substantial electoral support and were the second largest party and later became the largest party in the German parliament. That's also a fact that we seem to sometimes neglect. They had about 1/3 of the vote of the German people. And that, as you can see, is a very early picture of the Nazi party, and you can see Hitler over there as well as many of the other officials of the Nazis. Later on, they became much more organized. And the impression that Nazis did not read philosophy, were not aware of philosophical debates would also be incorrect. In fact, largely they considered Nietzsche. Nietzsche may not have considered them to be his followers, but they largely considered Nietzsche to be their inspiration. And Henrik Hoffmann's book, for example, that sold 500,000 copies in 1938, featured this particular photograph of Hitler visiting Nietzsche's home, being escorted by his sister, Elizabeth, etc. Where he takes this photograph next to Nietzsche's bust. So what is fascism? Well, first and foremost, the word itself is something that was created by Mussolini. And it's an old word which means a bundle of rods, which was used in the time of Rome to punish people. They could hit people with that bundle of rods, and if they had a blade on it, they could even execute people with this bundle of rods. So this bundle of rods, which you can see in Italy in many places, basically is a symbol of Roman state authority and used to punish people and to really maintain order. So the word fascism comes from this ancient Roman symbol, and in doing so, obviously says two major things. Number one, that we are the continuity of the great Roman civilization, and number two, that we stand for order and state power. So fascism has also been characterized as radical nationalism. The term radical has undergone many changes even in my own lifetime. There was a time when the word radical basically meant left wing. But now the term radical means anyone who departs from the mainstream either towards the left or towards the right. So if you look up any dictionary, you'll come across something of this sort. You'll read something to the extent that fascism is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce. And of course that is correct, but that's rather short, succinct, and leaves out quite a bit of what happened to give rise to fascism. Of course, we also know that it came to prominence in the early 20th century. So you see posters of this sort with respect to fascism. So I think if you're really going to try and understand the philosophy of fascism, you really have to understand this guy, Mussolini, because Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, is really not a shadow on Mussolini's own understanding of what fascism stood for. He's the real theoretician. There are many others as well, but he's by far the superior theoretician as far as fascism is concerned. He is the person who coins the term and so on. And in Italy, what was going on is that when World War I broke out, the government of Italy, and specifically the Socialist Party of Italy, which became later the Communist Party of Italy, was also the party of Antonio Gramsci, did not want to go to war. The socialists did not want to go to war. Italy did not want to go to war. And Mussolini was a member of the Italian Socialist Party and disagreed with his own party and said, no, Italy must not be deprived of the opportunity to go to war, conquer other lands, gain colonies, and therefore become a great civilization. So it was over World War I, first and foremost, that this disagreement erupted. And as it erupted, Mussolini then began to oppose liberalism, Marxism, humanism, egalitarianism, all of which he saw as opponents of Italy's rise to power. He began to argue that liberal democracy was obsolete. The public-private distinction, which was one of the cornerstones of liberal democracy as well as legal theory today, was obsolete, irrelevant, etc. And he began to strongly advocate that Italy enter World War I and become mobilized as a military state. Citizenship should be militarized, and that the state should manage and take over nearly all aspects of life in order to turn Italy into a society that could fight and win a war. And as you can see, Mussolini, in his early days at least, also a very good speaker, was also a very popular politician to begin with. Now, one of the most sophisticated explanations, there are many explanations of fascism that we have. The one that I find most convincing and relatively speaking most sophisticated is one offered by Antonio Gramsci, who was, as you know, in Italy, in the Socialist Party of Italy. Now, his view is that in the south of Italy, specifically in Turin and so on, where workers began to become much better organized and their trade unions were very strong, and they began a movement against the local capitalists and the landlords and so on, that this working class movement began to threaten the rich landlords and the big businessmen, who feared that there would be a Bolshevik-style uprising in Italy. And in order to suppress the subaltern masses, they began to then organize groups called black shirts at first, whose main function was to go and break up the trade unions, whose main function was to go and beat up working class trade union activists and so on, destroy their offices and destroy their printing presses in particular, which were very effective. So the violent suppression of the left in Italy specifically was one of the main cornerstones of Italian fascism, and later also of German fascism, as you'll see. And for Gramsci, at least, fascism was mainly a reaction to the emergence of socialism and the inability of liberalism to deal with war and the economic crisis. So, of course, at this time, liberalism was a very powerful argument, and it was unable to cope either with the economic dislocation caused by the war, so fascist thought, or the challenge that the socialists were posing to the given order. Hence, for Gramsci at least, fascism cannot be separated from the class struggle itself. Fascism was a product of the ruling class becoming militarized for two reasons. Number one was to crush the domestic opposition in the form of the trade union and working class and left movement in the country, to also sideline and sometimes even crush the liberals that they saw as being far too vacillating and unsure and to compromise with respect to pacifism to really take on the tasks that needed to be taken on. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, to militarize society and enter into the big struggles of what they saw, big struggles of history, and to capture a piece of the pie as the division of the world was being redivided during World War I. They wanted to get into that game and wanted, well, colonies and greater influence. So here we have, no, not Hitler, that's Charlie Chaplin. Nobody seemed to have guessed it. Nobody said, sir, that's not Hitler. Did you guess it? Anyone? No, he didn't, don't lie. Anyway, that's Charlie Chaplin, so one of my favorite actors. Let's go to Hitler, that's him. So in the late 1920s, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, what is shortened in the English language as the Nazi Party, came to the forefront, fighting street battles, fighting against trade unions and communists and campaigning to become and became one of the largest parties in the country. And they also had their own sort of equivalent of the black shirts, which were, of course, the brown shirts. By the way, a lot of times when there's two movements that generally wear black. One is, of course, the fascist movement. What's the other one? Anyone? Feminists? Pacifists? Environmentalists? Yes? The anti-fascists. Sometimes they wear black, but that's not their traditional color. But there's a reason why some of the anti-fascists wear black, and that's the reason I want you to get at. So the answer is the anarchists. So anarchists also wore black, and Italian fascists also wore black, and Hitler's sort of stormtroopers used to wear brown. By the way, are you familiar with the Khaksar Tehreek? What would they wear?
They used to wear brown.
Yes, khaki. That's where you get Khaksar from. That's correct. And they were also inspired by German fascism, by the way, although they were very anti-colonial at the same time. Yes?
Sir, ISIS will be black shirt.
That's got nothing to do with it. That has nothing to do with it. Though you may make the argument that the inter-services intelligence is fascist or whatnot, but I think, it's got nothing to do with that. But anyway, just because somebody wears black doesn't mean that they're fascist, I mean, the Shias also wear black in Muharram, and it's Muharram right now. So, but nobody's yet called them fascist. All right, so they gained about a third of the vote, but they had about nearly almost half of the seats in the parliament. And in 1933, when the German parliament burnt down, they accused the Communist Party of Germany of trying to burn down parliament. And then they took special powers called the Enabling Act in 1933, and then Hitler had complete undivided power over Germany. So this is one of the famous appeals that Hitler made on radio to the German people. He says the Weimar coalition that ruled the country since November 9th, 1980 generated 14 years of Marxist rule, i.e. under the largest party, the Social Democrats, that dominated the other parties in the Weimar coalition. Unless the German people reacted against this Bolshevism, there would be anarchy. Germany's fate was in the hands of Almighty God and German voters. So you can very clearly see that he was very clear what his mission was. And here you see some very interesting figures because, you see the Nazi Party in May 1928 only has 12 seats. And then suddenly in September 1930 has 108 seats, goes from, like PTI, goes from very few seats to dominating and then continues to rise, etc. And the other interesting thing to see from here is in comparison to the Nazi Party, you look at the Social Democrats, they had 153 seats, a massive, massive presence in 1928. They were the largest party. So the left really dominated Germany at this particular point in time. And if you look at the split off from the Social Democratic Party, those who followed the Bolsheviks, that's the Communist Party, they had 54 seats in parliament, much larger than the Nazis. And that in fact expanded and went all the way up to 100. So they had, substantial influence, and together the sort of Social Democrats and the Communists together, this is sort of very, this is the left bloc really. So they had a substantial number of seats. And beech mein sara jo, everything in the middle gets polarized between these two sides. And the Nazis managed then to, to get enough seats really to become the largest party. So one of the big elections was between Hindenburg and Hitler. Oh, here's another interesting graph that you see. But let me just say, you can look at this graph here, and that's Hitler. You can't read it. That's Hindenburg. And you can see most of it is swept by him. But he was like 88 years old, or 84 years old. And so he couldn't actually really run the government. The Social Democrats and so on were all supporting him. But he himself then decided to make Hitler the chancellor and so on. So you can see that initially the Nazi Party didn't have a lot of support aside from a few districts and so on. Look at this interesting graph over here. I thought this was really fascinating. May 1928, you know that in 1928 is the great stock market crash, which brings the world, European economy certainly, and even the world economy to a grinding halt, causes masses of people to be unemployed and to be thrown off from work, etc. Look at the rise of the Nazi Party, shoots straight up, and SPD, which is the Social Democratic Party, is sort of declining slowly and so on. So here's the KPD, which is also on an incline, but relatively speaking a slow one, catching up with the Social Democrats, but certainly not powerful enough to overwhelm the Nazis. Together, though, they did have enough power, but they were also, had very, very strong disagreements, and so really couldn't really work together well. So the fascists, one more interesting thing is that another aspect that we often associate with fascism is that their main program was against the Jews, right? Because that is the aspect that gets covered the most in movies and films and so on. And when you look at it that way, you tend to not see the big picture here. Because the Italian fascist movement, for example, had nothing to do with hatred for the Jews, nothing at all. And the German fascist movement began persecuting the Jewish community of Germany quite early on. But the massacres, the large-scale massacres at Auschwitz and so on, really began to occur in World War, during and in World War II. So much later, in fact, than Hitler came to power. Although there were other forms of persecution, but the mass extermination began really in World War II. So if we just think of them as being anti-Jewish, this anti-Jewish politics, I think it's insufficient. They had a larger agenda. The agenda was, we want to enter into war, we want to do this, we want to have more colonies, we want to defeat the Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks and so on and so forth. And in that larger framework, they saw the Jewish community as being a very serious, major obstacle. And perhaps they saw it that way because the Jewish community across Europe is, once it had assimilated after the Enlightenment period and so on into Europe, has really thrived in Europe, and not just economically, but more importantly, intellectually. And so intellectually, they played a very important role in many of the movements in Europe, and specifically with respect to liberalism and also with respect to the left. You saw a very high concentration of people there on the left and on the liberal spectrum who belonged to what you could call secularized the secularized Jewish community. So the Nazis also saw the Jews not just because they hated, or rather saw the Jews as an enemy to their project, not just in the sense that the Jews were accused of having betrayed Christ 2,000 years ago. That wasn't what was the only thing going in their minds. But more importantly, what was going on in politics at the time and how they perceived that the Jewish community somehow or the other was a block on their imperial ambitions and their ambitions for war. So why did the Nazis admire Nietzsche? I want to speak a little bit about Nietzsche, but before I do so, I want to just bring in something here that Shamail and I spoke about. Nietzsche passed away much before the fascist movement or the Nazi movement or any of the fascist movements began. And his ideas are rather somewhat complex, and I think they need to be grasped in their complexity. While at the same time it is a fact that the fascists themselves greatly admired Nietzsche, read him, published him, and thought that everything he had said was in line with what they were themselves thinking. So one of the questions that we're going to look at is, what was it in Nietzsche, perhaps, that inspired them, or that attracted them, rather? The thing that isn't there in Nietzsche, you'll see, is the kind of anti-Jewish sentiment that you associate often with Nazism, that they burnt Christ and so on and so forth, and they betrayed Christ, and therefore they must be, they must be eliminated or something of that sort. That doesn't exist. In fact, the anti-Semitic party, Nietzsche thought that the anti-Semitic party was rather not just dull, boring, but he once even remarked that they should be shot right down to the last man because they're just pathetic. Perhaps didn't really literally mean it that way, but he really did think, because his sister was married to someone who was very much an anti-Jewish, anti-Semite, etc. So he wasn't saying kill my brother-in-law. Maybe he felt it at some point, but the point is that metaphorically speaking, he thought that this is just rubbish. So fascists greatly admired Nietzsche. Here's another interesting thing about the fascists is that although they are a right-wing movement, and in that sense you can consider them, sort of on conservatives, but on the other hand, they weren't your traditional conservatives either. They weren't your traditional right-wing. They were not part of the sort of theocratic right-wing politics of Europe. They were not part of the church and all of that. In fact, at that level, they were rather anti-conservative in a certain sense. They were rather, off the beaten track in many of their ideas with respect to social conservatism. They were political conservatives, certainly, but they were not social conservatives in the sense that Khadim Rizvi, for example, is a social conservative, right? One of the key ideas that we're going to talk about is the question of slave morality, the role of Christianity and Judaism and so on in informing that. So maybe I should cover that later, but very briefly, Nietzsche thought that the Jewish people had been enslaved for thousands of years, and as a result of their enslavement had developed what he called a slave mentality. And the Jewish people had created Christianity, which, according to Nietzsche, he thought encapsulated that slave mentality. Not slave mentality in the sense that they wanted to be slaves, but slave mentality in the sense that they had a mentality as slaves which they wanted to transfer to society in order for their protection, in order to better their circumstances. And the result of that on European civilization was extremely negative, according to Nietzsche. That the Jews had bequeathed Christianity, which as a whole created a slave mentality amongst Europeans and did not allow Europe to, or individuals even within Europe, to achieve their full potential. Therefore, that slave mentality had to be gotten rid of. So at that level, you see, Nietzsche can, to some extent, be accused of being an anti-Semite. But that's a very different kind of argument from the traditional argument, traditional anti-Semitic argument that the church, etc., and many others made. And last but not least, his concept of Superman. Yes?
Taimur, would you mind explaining a bit more about which features of Christianity Nietzsche would have said
Yeah.
are exemplifying?
I'm going to come to that.
Some of that?
I will. I'll come to that in just a bit. It's later on.
Okay.
Yeah. But keep that in your mind. Keep that in your mind. What were the features? What is this slave mentality? What are the features? And how did they impact things? So I'll discuss that in just a bit when I come there. Now, I want to read a little bit from Nietzsche, because whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he is no doubt a phenomenal writer. The first time you read him, you just cannot put him down because he writes so well. He's not really concerned with being methodological. He's not really even concerned with being, I'll define my terms very carefully and so on. He just writes, much like Heidegger and Nietzsche, both have the same style in that way. He just writes in the old style of philosophy, what he wants to say. So here we have a section from the Gay Science, which was also repeated in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is a madman is talking. Pagal aadmi. Huh? Pagal aadmi jo hai wo keh raha hai, kya keh raha hai? God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Sabse pehli baat to isme, just to pause here, he's not celebrating it. He's lamenting the death of God here. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Now this is, when Nietzsche says these lines from a madman, I think he's not just being sort of scared about, he's not just sort of trying to protect himself and saying, main nahi keh raha, koi aur keh raha, sort of thing, which is, what somebody in Pakistan might end up doing. But he's saying something quite different. He's saying that something that was there at the center of our lives, of European lives, of our civilization for thousands of years, that guided us, that taught us right from wrong, that told us, what to do, when to do it, how to behave with our children, how to behave with our parents, how to behave in society. Something that was so central to our lives is suddenly no more. Why is it no more? What has taken it away? Who has killed it? Who has killed that central notion of truth, justice, God? Why is it destroyed? Nietzsche thought that the Enlightenment, which had basically substituted science in the place of religion, had undermined and destroyed God from our lives, just eliminated God from our lives. And he didn't think this was a good thing. He thought this was a terrible thing, because what it created is a sense of a loss of direction, a meaninglessness in our lives. How are we supposed to order our lives in an era where God no longer exists? The question is also raised in Pakistan. For example, on social media, if you go on social media and you have a discussion or debate with someone who's strongly religious, they'll make the argument quite often. They say, if you don't believe that God exists, how do you know right from wrong? How do you know good from evil? How do you order your life? What basis do you use to order your life? Because for thousands of years, that's the basis we've used. So what is the new basis? That's the real question. So the death of God, the age of enlightenment had taken away, as you correctly pointed out, the church and God from the lives of Europeans. But there's something even fundamentally much more important that Nietzsche is talking about. He's saying it's not just religion that has died. It's our belief in absolute values. It is the death of truth itself. We've stopped believing that there is, because for so many centuries we believed there is a truth. The truth is God. God has given us this book, and that is the truth, and so on. Now that's gone. Now, it's not just that that has gone. What has gone with it also is our fundamental belief that there is a truth, that there are absolute values. How many of you say things like, it's all perspectives, I don't know what the truth is, there is no truth, there is no objectivity, there is no scientific explanation, right? We often have this conversation. It's your perspective, this is his perspective, this is my perspective, this is a woman's perspective, this is a black perspective, this is a working class perspective, etc., etc., etc. This is a bourgeois perspective, whatever. Which one is right? Well, they're all right and they're all not right. There's really no basis for judgment because there is no absolute truth. How many of you think, yeah, that makes sense, there isn't no absolute truth? Is there an absolute truth? Right? So you're reflecting exactly what Nietzsche is saying. That absolute truth is no longer a part of our intellectual makeup. So it's not just, as I wanted to point this out to you, it's not just the death of the church, it's the death of truth. Because God was the truth, and that's gone from our lives. He doesn't mean by, let me also clarify, he doesn't mean that the actual Almighty is no more or something. He just means it's gone from our lives. This has created a situation where humanity is approaching nihilism, meaninglessness, yes, meaninglessness, yeah, that's right. Life has become without meaning. We don't have a direction, we don't know which way to go, we don't know what to do. Now, Nietzsche is not proposing that a life without meaning is a good thing. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that that is the condition that Europe is in. Now, the question he asks is, how do we order our lives in the absence of God? How do we order our lives in the absence of any place where we can anchor the truth? What do we do? So, to answer the question, the first thing you have to do is get rid of your slave mentality. What was that? The Jews, who were an enslaved people, Nietzsche thought, introduced Christianity into Western civilization. Christianity has a slave morality. Its goal is to limit the power of the strong. Please note this down somewhere. Very, very important. The goal of Christianity was to say the strong should not dominate the world, society, whatever. In fact, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. If you read through the Bible, again and again this idea is repeated, that the meek, the weary, the poor, the oppressed are the ones who will inherit the earth. So, and I think this is historically accurate. Nietzsche is not being inaccurate here, that the people who embraced Christianity, well, the Jews themselves were an enslaved people under the pharaohs, and then of course their state broke up and so on, and they were enslaved in Babylon, in the Babylonian kingdom, and in the Assyrian kingdom as well. So that is absolutely true, but even more fundamentally, that Christianity was a revolt of the underclass against Roman rule also is true. And the supporters of Christianity, certainly of early Christianity, were the poorest of the poor and so on and so forth. So the Judeo-Christian slave revolt in ethics had insidiously turned the tables on the masters by declaring that strength was evil and weakness was a good thing. This is Nietzsche's central and very important idea. Please note that this is not a criticism of religion in that sense. It's a criticism of the culture generated by a given religious movement, which he believes is one that does not appreciate strength. It cannot appreciate, being proud of yourself. It cannot appreciate you taking pride in your abilities and so on, and in developing them, but rather wants to keep everybody meek and says, जो क्लास में लास्ट आता है वो ही अच्छा बच्चा है, जो पढ़ाई नहीं करता उस पर मुझे कितना तरस आ रहा है, जो पढ़ाई करता है और कहता है I'm gonna get ahead and I don't care if you don't like me or whatnot, that is not the kind of person that, according to Nietzsche, Christianity is supporting, promoting, or appreciating. So Nietzsche's anti-civilizational animus, our ideals of beauty, morality, and truth, are intrinsically meaningless. And what Nietzsche wanted to do was to philosophize with a hammer. And I was all thinking कि आज मैं हथौड़ी लेके आऊँगा. But then I ran out of time and so on, and I couldn't get a hathodi. But I really wanted to get a nice big hathodi like the one that Thor has and bang it on this table just to make that point. But so you can just imagine it, right? Here's me banging that big hammer on the table. He wanted to break it all up. What did he want to break? This slave morality. So his philosophy is extremely aggressive, you can say. He's an aggressive kind of guy because he wants to destroy 2,000 years of this mentality, this culture that he feels has kept Europe in chains. If you destroy that, you destroy the idea that there is a right and a wrong. You destroy the idea that God knows right and wrong and can create it and has bequeathed it to us. Then what basis do we have left to order our lives, to not fall into complete despair and meaninglessness, nihilism, etc.? What basis do we have? Mr. Nietzsche, you may be asking. He says the basis is the will to power. And in fact, he thinks that the world, the history of humanity, all of humanity, and not just the history of humanity, but the history of everything that's living, from plants, animals to insects, etc., is the will to power and nothing besides. So you see a very Hegelian sort of jump here, that all of history is going to be interpreted in this singular impulse or logic or whatnot. What is the will to power? The purpose of life, he says, is to strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living and because life simply is will to power. What is life? When you are born, you have to take your first breaths, and those are difficult and painful. And how do you take them? You have to grit well, you don't have any teeth to grit at that time, but you have to really, you have to work against, the forces of nature to inhale that thing. Pehle to aapko, you're getting it from your mother, but now you have to inhale, now you have to feed, now you have to feed yourself, you have to fight against the diseases and everything. And every minute that you live, your body is in a struggle. You are not even realizing it. You're like, I'm in no struggle here. I'm kind of chilling out here. But your body is in a struggle against all the different microbes and viruses and bacteria that are attacking your body, and your body is fighting back. It has its white blood cells, and they're like punching through and saying, don't you dare attack, me, and I'm going to. And if it fails from the attacks that come from without and from within, then your body will deplete, and you will go towards death. And if it wins, your body will expel those things, destroy those things, and survive and live. And it's just not just true for the body, it's true for the plant. The plant breaks out of its own seed and then breaks out of the soil, and it's constantly fighting against a hostile environment. And it has to appropriate things from that environment to survive, just as you do. I mean, we might like to think of life as being, we get our food in the kitchen, and we go to PDC and eat it, and so on and so forth. But the chicken is something that we slaughtered, and we bred it, we slaughtered it, and then we ate it, and you never even saw the slaughter. But that's what's going on, isn't it? And when we eat meat and so on and so forth, and the plants too, you can see that we uproot them. They are living things, and yet we uproot them in order to live. That's just the way life is, says Nietzsche. Anything else you think about is you're just fooling yourselves into thinking into a utopia. Knowledge and values, therefore, that enhance life are what life strives for. So what is it that we should look for? What would be the light to which we would direct our efforts? That which brings life to you, which makes you happy, which makes you want to conquer the world. You come out of the classroom and you say, "Rah!" That is good. If you come out of this classroom, you're like, I don't want to live anymore. That's the kind of knowledge that Nietzsche would say, just throw that in the bin. Don't even think about that. If that's utterly useless for you, because it's destroying you from the inside. And I want you to move towards those things that make you want to live, that make you want to live full of vitality, a full life. So that's all art, all literature, all philosophy, all ideas, all basis of morality that push you down and prevent you from becoming who you are and from really embracing life in its fullest are things that are completely should be done away with. My idea, he says, is that every specific body strives to become master over all space and to extend its force, its will to power, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. But it continually encounters similar efforts on the part of other bodies and ends by coming to an arrangement, a union, with those of them that are sufficiently related to it. Thus, they then conspire together for power, and the process goes on. So he's not Hobbesian in the sense that he thinks every man for himself and we're all going to, my will to power is going to be opposed to your will to power. No, the various wills to power can co-join with each other, live together, strive together, and work together towards the light, towards life, and so on and so forth. What about law and what about justice? To speak, therefore, of just or unjust in itself is quite senseless. In itself, of course, no injury, assault, exploitation, destruction can be unjust, since life operates essentially, that is, in its basic functions, through injury, through assault, through exploitation, destruction, and simply cannot be thought of at all without this character. As I told you, you are on top of the food chain. Now, if you don't see the food chain, that doesn't mean you're not on top of it. But you are slaughtering mankind, slaughtering, millions of animals to be on top of that food chain, And that's the reality you have to face. And not just animals, uprooting, as I said, crops in the prime of their life, you are uprooting them. Am I wrong? Paras? Take care on it. It's a fact of life, is it not? So on what basis can you say that is wrong? Because that really is the foundation of what nature has, the hand that nature has dealt you. One must indeed grant something even more unpalatable, that from the highest biological standpoint, legal conditions can never be other than exceptional conditions, since they constitute a partial restriction of the will of life, or the will to power, which is bent upon power and are subordinate to its total goal as a single means, namely as a means of creating greater units of power. A legal order thought of as sovereign and universal, not as a means in the struggle between power complexes, but as a means of preventing all struggles in general, perhaps after the communistic cliche of Düring, that every will must consider every other will its equal. You can also see a reflection not just of Düring here or Marx or Engels, but also of Rousseau, the general will. We must, find the general will where everybody is whatever equal and blah, blah, all of that stuff. Would be a principle, he says, which is hostile to life, an agent of the dissolution and destruction of man, an attempt to assassinate the future of man, a sign of weariness, a secret path to nothingness. If I were to consider your opinion equal to mine, that would be a path to nothingness, because I have spent my life studying political philosophy, and you've just started. And even if that was not the case, I still need to, even if I'm wrong and you are actually right, I still should have the confidence to assert whatever it is that I'm convinced of, even if it's wrong. Because the assertion, that proposition may be wrong, but the assertion of your proposition is not wrong, according to Nietzsche. It's the will to power. So you see here that Nietzsche does not consider either the sovereign or law or justice, if it in any way contradicts the will to power, to be something that we should consider worthy of upholding. Is Nietzsche Socratic? Well, he wants the welfare. Nietzsche has also had an enormous influence on psychology. What he wants is the welfare of the soul. By the soul here, I don't mean the roux in the religious sense, But by the soul here, I mean the mind, the psyche, your intellectual being. Nietzsche wants you to be a person that's healthy, even though he himself, poor fellow, was rather quite unhealthy in the sense that he had a really bad disease, etc., which robbed him of his ability to speak and sent him into spiraling into madness towards the end of his life. Many people thought that that madness itself was, Nietzsche sort of expressing his philosophy in action. That's kind of an interesting theory itself. But the point is, he wants you to be well. He doesn't want you to be unwell. He doesn't want you to be worried and fretting and neurotic and so on and so forth. He is concerned with the Aristotelian distinction between mere life and the good life. He wants you to have the good life. And the good life is, you can get it when you have the will to power. Wisdom or truth represented the key to human flourishing, which is a Socratic conviction. So examined at the individual level, therefore, when we think, who can deny, can you deny this? Forget about, what you've been taught with vis-a-vis morality. This is a principle that life ought to be lived. It was created to be lived. Anything that comes in the way of you living your life and, destroying you psychologically or physically or whatever is something that's bad, and you have to fight against that. Can anybody deny that at the individual level? Is this a bad idea? Is this a fascist idea? So my question was, till this point in time, you've seen Nietzsche is talking about, the fact that you ought to order your life in a way, accept things in your life which make you stronger, make you live your life. Is that a bad thing? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Live a little, that just he added, but anyway, live a little longer, and so on. So that's the idea. Opposition is there, but you got to fight it, and if you fight it and you win, you become that much stronger. It's a good philosophy, is it not? Putting him in the best of light. But there is also a darkness here. Nietzsche can be a very dark writer as well. And he recognizes this in himself. He says, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. Look long enough into evil, evil can become part of you. That's what you have to avoid and you have to stop. So it's quite self-aware as well in this regard. So what is the darkness? Well, to begin with, we often think that Nietzsche is rather apolitical. For example, Nietzsche says in his writing that he is the last anti-political German. He doesn't care about politics. He's the last person who is anti-politics. He also says things like, state is the coldest of all cold monsters. It has no life, it has no heart. A death for many has been devised that glorifies itself as life. I call it the state. The state is where you die. Politics is where you die. That's what it's sounding like, correct? Only there where the state ceases does the man who is not superfluous begin. Does the song of the necessary man, the unique and irreplaceable melody begin. So from these passages, it would appear that Nietzsche is not only against the state, but he considers this kind of state politics, etc., to be the death of a person. To be concerned about, this itchy-bitchy, you said this and I said, like those talk shows. Nietzsche would laugh at those talk shows and say, what the hell are you all discussing? And the way you're discussing it is a joke. Just another quotation is quite nice. But it is the same with man as with the tree. The more he seeketh to rise into the height and light, the more vigorously do his roots struggle earthward, downward, into the dark and deep, into the evil. You got to enjoy this, man. You don't take it too seriously, okay? If you take it too seriously, then it's no longer any fun. And what we want to do is we want to enjoy ourselves because we're doing Nietzsche today. We don't want to be depressed. We want to be happy. So Enlightenment thought that they were fighting the great battle for reason against dogma, against superstition, against authority. They were humanists. They were universalists. They stood for the general will of the people, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They stood for the third estate and sat on the left side of the National Assembly in France, which is why which is where we get the term leftist from, because they sat on the left. And so this is the party of, this is not socialists we're talking about here. In the 18th century, the left are people, in the 18th and 19th century, the left are people who are not socialists, but basically people who believe in enlightenment, in humanism, in universalism, in liberalism. Francis Bacon, George Berkeley, Edmund Burke, Denis Diderot, Thomas Hobbes, Hume, Kant, Locke, Rousseau, Leibniz, Spinoza, Voltaire, Wollstonecraft, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Hegel, etc. And this is a beautiful painting, which is called a prophecy, where you see an image. We don't, of course, we are iconoclasts, so we don't like images. But you can see this is like a compass. And this is a divine sort of intervention, which is creating the world in a mathematical, in some mathematical proportion with a compass. The world is logical, knowable, understandable. Of course, there was also a reaction against the Enlightenment, which has been termed by Isaiah Berlin as the counter-Enlightenment. We can also look at the Romantic movement, of which, in fact, Rousseau also inspired it. And the Romantic movement is mainly an art movement and still dominates over art theory even today. And what it said was that we have to be close to nature, we have to be close to our own nature, and all this technology and this modernity has robbed us of coming to know ourselves and to know nature. So the Romanticism can be the Romantic movement can be considered as part of the broader anti-Enlightenment current, which on the one hand could be theological. The church fought back. They believed in order, the authority of the church, the authority of the king. They mistrusted reason and supported revelation. And you can see this in Pakistan today, that on the one hand you have people like Parvez Hoodbhoy, and on the other hand you have people like Auria Maqbool Jan, and they are fighting it out with each other. And Hoodbhoy says, I stand for reason, and Auria Maqbool Jan says, I stand for Islam, right? And I stand by the word of God, etc. So there's this clash that we see even today. They also thought that the masses were incapable of self-government. Democracy would be a really bad idea. They thought that man's natural condition was sin, which is why Christ, of course, was the Son of God, suffered on the cross to rid mankind of his sins. And over here, there's another really nice sort of painting which says, the sleep of reason produces monsters. And so you see this guy sleeping. He's not studying. He's sleeping. And what's coming out of him? Chingadars and so on. So if you go into the library and you go to sleep, just remember that you will generate monsters. Don't sleep. Another great debate of this period is Hegel versus Schelling. Hegel is considered one of the most profound thinkers of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. Also because he tries to create a system in which the whole of human history, its intellectual history, its political history, its artistic cultural history, is all captured in one process, which he calls the march of reason. Well, Prussian authorities, although he wasn't a revolutionary like Karl Marx and Engels, etc., there was sometimes they were inspired by Hegel, but he still managed to upset quite a few people, because in the Hegelian paradigm then, Christianity was only one step in the march towards reason. And so the conservatives really thought that what Hegel was saying was quite blasphemous. Schelling, on the other hand, was in favor of revolution, elitist values, appeal to myth and authority. Freedom was redefined subjectively as an inner state that can be maintained despite the vicissitudes of political life. It had deep pessimism towards the ability of human agents to create a more humane society. And later you had other people like Schopenhauer, etc., take up those themes. Romanticism similarly was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and to the values of the Industrial Revolution and to the Enlightenment. They wanted to go back to the countryside, to the peasantry, and so on and so forth. And they often thought that medieval values were far superior, not just to modern values, but even to the values of classical civilization, the Greco-Roman civilization. They didn't think that only reason created a basis for understanding. They thought that emotion was an equally powerful basis for understanding. And we're still having this debate between what's called the Apollonean and the Dionysian, aspects of humanity. Apollo was the god of reason, and Dionysus was the god of wine. One was the god of thought, and the other was the god of emotion. And the two are always clashing within humanity.
Feels versus reals.
Yes.
That's the latest terminology.
Is that it? I see. I wasn't familiar with that, but that's quite nice. So glorification of nature, glorification of the individual, glorification of folk art, and in particular medieval art and medieval custom, and a great abiding belief in spontaneity. It's very important. In music, this plays a very important role because those who were inspired by the romantic poets and artists of their time thought that a musician ought to be able to improvise. And if you're playing a concert, if everything is written down and you're just playing things note to note, you're not feeling it. It's just mechanical. You could have a computer do it, and the computer would probably do it even more perfectly than you do it. The whole point of being a musician is to be in the moment and play what you're feeling in that particular moment. And you play that spontaneously. And of course, the great artists of, you can feel proud that South Asia has the entire classical tradition of South Asian music is based entirely on improvisation. So the rag itself is meant to give you a basic structure around which you improvise. Anyway, 1848 saw revolutionary movements break out across Europe, bringing Romanticism more or less to an end, but not before it also then generated a series of thinkers, such as Hamann, for example, who argued that Johann Georg Hamann, who argued that epistemology should be replaced by the philosophy of language. Reason, he said, is language. And you can see the beginnings of the linguistic turn already very early on over here. Meister, who wrote the famous book Considerations on France, 1797, that the rationalist rejection of Christianity was directly responsible for the killing and bloodshed of the French Revolution. An argument that would become even stronger as we moved into the 19th and 20th century, where killing and war began to impact a greater and greater number of lives. And more people began to say that modernity and scientific modernity, instead of helping us, rational, instrumental rationality, instead of helping us, is destroying our lives. He argued against the universality of human experience. He famously said, I know Poles and Germans and English and French. I don't know what a human is. In other words, this idea of humanism, everybody sort of equal and so on and so forth, is all just nonsense. That's not how people really think. Bataille, who created a secret society and wanted the rebirth of the sacred and myth, and he wanted to combat materialism, secularism, individualism, and so on, was an iconoclast and so on and so forth, and wanted to relearn the forces of emotion, instinct, and spontaneity. So these are some of the three great writers of that period. Now along comes this fellow, and he's really quite a key person in the way in which this debate begins to develop. If you remember what we said about Plato from your previous courses, Socrates, Plato had already come to the conclusion that what you see as an appearance, in fact, hides the essence of a given thing. Appearance is deceptive. Knowledge from sense perception can be therefore deceptive. And the task of philosophy was to discover what lay behind the appearance. And this was famously, of course, depicted in the allegory of the cave, where people were looking at shadows. And those shadows is the material world. And what really needs to be discovered is the logic, the principle, the essence, the forms, as Plato would have put it, that shape the material world, that guide the material world. That's what has to be discovered. Like in The Matrix. How many of you have seen The Matrix? Good, more people than... I love giving Matrix examples. So in The Matrix, Neo, who's fighting the evil Matrix, at one point or another manages to decode the entire program. And once he decodes the entire program, everything appears to him as numbers. and he's able to fight everybody off and beat them. And that's like the yay moment, right? Well, Husserl wants to go in the absolutely opposite direction. Instead of examining what is behind the appearance, he wants you to try and examine how it is that the world appears to you. How can that not be an important thing, he says. How do you experience the world? How do you sense the world? Whatever you call reason comes later. The first and most fundamental thing is how you interact with whatever it is inside and outside of yourself. How does that come to you? And that is what's called phenomenology. He is considered the father of phenomenology. So the phenomena is how you see it, the appearance of it. The essence is what's behind the phenomena, what's hidden from our view. So he's not concerned now with Plato, but rather with the opposite. I want to understand how it is that you feel what you feel, and how can we scientifically study that. So in other words, he wants to understand the subjectivity of human experience. I'll skip over this slide and go straight to Heidegger. Heidegger was a student of Husserl, who was a Jew, and this is now, we're entering into the Nazi period where Jews are going to be persecuted and so on. But Heidegger, first and foremost, was also inspired by his teacher and wants to really think about phenomenology and wants to think about being, wants to apply phenomenology to the question of being. From 2,600 years ago, we have had an ancient distinction, a dualism in philosophy between the object and the subject. The object exists outside of us. The subject is what is perceiving the object. And this debate about what the relationship between the subject and object has been at the foundation of philosophy and metaphysics in particular. And what Heidegger finds is that this whole debate has been misunderstood, misconstrued from a translation of the Greeks and needs to be revisited and re-understood. Now, this is all sounding rather abstract and so on, but you'll see how it will come together quite quickly. Greeks, he thought, had an authentic experience of being as unconcealment, kind of like when you unconceal something to look at what's happening over there. The process of unconcealment simultaneously conceals a lot of other things. When you unconceal that, it conceals what was previously unconcealed. So the discovery of being is somewhat like that. The phenomenology is somewhat like that. So when Descartes says, for example, cogito ergo sum, some people pronounce the G, anyway, I think therefore I am, he's already created the subject-object distinction. That's the problem. That being, your existence, you yourself, man, the subjective side of man, was reified into a relation between a thing and its properties. So we are trying to think of, what he's saying is, to translate this into easier language. We are trying to think about, what are we thinking about, first of all? Are we thinking about God? No. We are thinking about the being that thinks about its own being. The human being is the only being which thinks about its own existence. A rock does not, a cat does not, a dog does not, an object does not think. And an animal, presumably, is unable to think about its own existence. So the being we are dealing with is a being that thinks about its own existence. Now, what that means is, he came up with a concept, is that he called it design. It's not design like, this is a good design. What that means is being in the world, being there in the world. So that being, which is thinking about its own being, is part of the world it's thinking about. It's not outside of it. But the way in which Western metaphysics has distinguished the subject-object, it has thought of the thinking being in much the same way as it thinks of an object with properties. What it really needs to understand is that this being is part of the world it's thinking about. And in that way, the subject-object would collapse. The distinction, the dualism would collapse. The human way of being is fundamentally different from the way of being of an object, because the human way of being is a way in which we think about our own being, our own existence. Why do I live? Do I even exist? How do I know I exist? And then Descartes says, I think, therefore I must exist. Something must exist that's doing the thinking. Well, that's a classic example of a being thinking about their own being. Being is being in the world, not outside of it. It is a being in use in the world. The second thing is, you are first in the world and then you begin thinking about it. It's not even like you're outside the world, you look at the world, you're like, oh, I want to get in there, and then you get in there or something. No, you're just born in it. You're like a being that is constantly, like a hammer that's in use without realizing it's a hammer. A being that is part of the world. Therefore, there is no such thing as a world apart from our experience, any more than our experience is separable from the social historical context in which we live. This subject-object duality is a trick of language that needs to be, in fact, deconstructed. He used this term specifically, deconstructed. It's a reification. What does the term reification mean? What does it mean? It means where something that is not absolutely real appears to us as being real. The world cannot be understood objectively or subjectively. You can see wo jo purani debate thi between people who were saying, on the one hand, we want to understand the world scientifically, objectively, rationally, and the others who were saying, man cannot be completely rational, man has limited rationality, a limited mind. You can't understand the world rationally because you're a limited human being. Well, he's saying that whole thing is absolutely bekar, and he wants to bring it together. Western languages, he says, sadly, are infused with the subject-object duality in the way of subject-predicate, the way the grammar is laid out. But we've got to get free from that and think in a different way. So we've got to understand the truth, which he calls hermeneutics, which is a big word, but basically means interpretation. The human way of being has no properties or essence. Like Socrates was trying to figure out, or Plato is trying to say, what is the essence of a man? What is the essence of a dog, etc. These are ridiculous questions according to Heidegger. If you ask what is the essence of a human being, you can't figure it out because you're treating a human being as you would treat an object. And that is exactly what being is not, because it's thinking. It is the one doing the thinking. Nobody outside of it is doing it. The truth of our being is unconcealed to us just as perceptual truths, our view is always perspectival. So every unconcealed truth conceals other truths. I already went over this. And this creates an infinite hermeneutic, in other words, an interpretation process. We're constantly, the subject-object duality is completely false. We are thinking about our own being all the time, and we are the ones at the same time doing the thinking. In this regard, he says, what is relevant about the way in which we experience the world, the phenomenology, is that we care. What does he mean by care? He doesn't mean, oh, I care about the world, I want to hug a tree. What he says is that we are participants in this world. We are part of it. And it means something to us. It means something to me when you're like, oh, God, sir, is not making any sense to me, or I don't really like this class. It means something. It has some meaning to me. What are those meanings? Well, there's three parts. First is the facticity of the situation, of a given situation. In other words, the given. I have a body, there is a history, there is a context in which I'm thrown. This is also called thrownness. Then there's fallenness, living according to the wishes of others, which he calls inauthenticity, where because we are surrounded by a certain historical context, body, history, etc., in that context, there are various forces acting on us to act a certain way. And when we accept those forces, we live according to the wishes of others, not our own wishes. And that, he says, is an inauthentic life, where you're living according to the wishes of others. You can see a reflection of Nietzsche here as well. And last, existentiality is the knowledge of the imminent death. And that alone makes an authentic life possible. We're all going to die. I hate to bring this news to you, but there's absolutely no exception. What that means is that we have to embrace life in the now. Only knowledge of our death can help us embrace life in the now. And by embracing life, he means here, of course, also a Nietzscheite theme, which is embracing yourself, embracing your individuality, embracing what it is that you want to be as a person, rather what it is that others want you to be. And that would be an authentic life. So very interesting stuff here. Similarly, with respect, that was what he said with respect to being. He said similar things with respect to time in his famous work, Being in Time. We imagine time as a linear objective movement, right? वो देखो घड़ी कैसे जा रही, tuck, tuck, tuck. And every time it goes tuck, the same amount of time goes by. But is that the way, आपका क्या नाम है? Yes. ये नीचे. Khubab. Is that the way you experience time? Is that the phenomenology of time that you experience? No, you don't experience time that way. I gave away the answer when I shook my head a little bit. How do you experience time then? Is it linear for you? No. What is it like? Right now is time going by really fast, is it going by really slow? Really slow, correct? But if you're doing something like, I don't know, jumping off a cliff or something, would time be going by very fast or slow? It would be different, certainly, right? If you're enjoying something, it goes by extremely quickly.
If you're microwaving something, it gets slower.
Good point, because you're hungry. And the hungrier you are, the longer that microwave seems to take. Absolutely. We don't ever experience time subjectively, objectively, as linear. We experience it always in very many different ways. Sometimes it's elongated when you're waiting at the doctor for an appointment. Sometimes, boom, 10 years go by, your kids are grown up, and you're like, whatever happened to you? How did you grow up so quickly? Right? All of this stuff happens. So we don't experience it linearly. Also, we live ahead of ourselves all the time. I'm here in time, but I'm already thinking, शाम को जाऊंगा, एक lemon malt ले जाऊंगा, Netflix पे फलानी फिल्म देखूंगा. I'm already planning for the future. You're planning, masters करूंगी, उसके लिए set करना पड़ेगा, I don't, वगैरह वगैरह, whatever, right? You're already thinking, oh my God, when am I going to get out of this classroom? This Heidegger stuff is really getting to my head. Whatever. You're already living ahead of your time. And also, you can live behind. You can think of the past. This morning when I woke up, I really should have brushed my teeth. You can change the past. You can imagine the past in a way that doesn't really exist. Like, for example, you can say, well, actually, I did really brush my teeth, didn't I? Yeah, I did. You change it yourself, however you want to change it. So we don't experience time at all in the way that we conceive of time in science. In fact, our subjective experience, our phenomenological experience of time is totally different from the objective experience of time, or the scientific conception of time. So all this suggests that those conceptions of time themselves are deeply flawed. Now, one very interesting thing about Heidegger, going back, is he wrote this book, and it's incredibly influential. And the man was a committed, card-carrying Nazi party member, absolutely committed to Nazism. So says some very fascinating, very interesting, very complex things, but is a Nazi. And has had an enormous impact. In fact, if I were to say who is arguably one of the most influential 20th century philosopher, Heidegger certainly would be in the first couple of, either he'd be number one or he'd be in the first five, easily. But he's a Nazi, he is. And not just, sort of, thoda maut kar liya, but really committed to it. So how do we understand this continuity now? Is Nietzsche also coming in the line of Hamann and Meister and others, etc., Heidegger to khair baad mein aayega, but anyway, can we also think of him as a counter-Enlightenment intellectual, asks the reading I gave you, which is Woolen. Nietzsche argues for the death of truth and reason. The will to power becomes the ethics of a new world. Heidegger argues the case of ontological nihilism. Existence is not recognized by reason, but by design, being practically engaged in the world, being there in the world. So both have a common theme. The rejection of reason, you see, runs like a thread from the counter-Enlightenment through Nietzsche into Heidegger. But when Nietzsche comes to us, much later in the 21st century, he comes to us mainly from the interpretation of these three great authors, Kaufmann, Klossowski, and Neiman. And they have translated Nietzsche, and Woolen says that they've done a great disservice because they have watered him down. They've made him a mild little kitten. He's a lion. They've made him a little kitten. How have they done that? He says, a truth claim is a manifestation of the will to power. There is only therefore perspectival seeing. There's different perspectives. You can look at things this way or that way. Only a perspectival knowing. Appearance is all there is. Style counts more than truth. Nietzsche's chameleonic changes are a vast literary charade, they say. The purpose of life is to reconstruct the self on an aesthetic basis, that is, as a work of art. Your life is a work of art, and you are the author of that work of art. Similarly, Western metaphysics is a gigantic miscarriage. What we have are perspectives. There are no facts, only interpretations. Truth is a kind of error without which a certain species of life could not live. We need the truth. We need to believe that there is a truth, but actually there is not necessarily any truth. Life is a process of incessant and directionless self-transformation. The end of self-transformation is aesthetic, making oneself more attractive and interesting. The world is a work of art that gives birth to itself. We possess art lest we perish of truth. And finally, they also thought that Nietzsche's illness, his delirium, was emblematic of his greatness. The total obscurity was an insight into the essential chaos underlying all being. To attack the very notion of lucidity, he had reached the limit of the principles of identity and reality, and so on. Nietzsche, by lapsing into silence, spoke the truth. So this entire sort of interpretation of Nietzsche, Wolin says, has made him into a little kitten. He's a Thor. And in his book, Twilight of the Idols, he says how to philosophize with a hammer. He wanted to break things, not just make you slightly more interesting and slightly more aesthetic. Oh my God, that is so like, that's nothing. So one thing is very clear. Nietzsche, in his own time, despised all the egalitarian movements, the democratic movements for reform and socialism and so on and so forth. He despised Christianity not because it was religious, but because it promoted a slave morality that sets in motion a process which culminates in the Enlightenment's final unmasking of religious beliefs, an event he called the death of God. The Enlightenment ushers us in an age in which values can no longer be grounded, an age of nihilism. So he dislikes Christianity not because it's superstitious, which is why Enlightenment people didn't like it, but because it is egalitarian. This is a key thing to understand about Nietzsche. If you don't understand it, you misunderstand Nietzsche, in my view. Nietzsche, on the Paris Commune defeat of 1871, for example, very explicitly said, hope is possible again. Shukr hai in mazdoron ko defeat kiya hai. Our German mission isn't over yet. I'm in better spirit than ever, for not yet everything has capitulated to Franco-Jewish leveling and elegance and to the greedy instincts of the Jet-Zeit now time, over and above the war between nations that international hydra, which suddenly raised its fearsome heads, has alarmed us by heralding quite other different battles to come. So very much opposed to the communards of Paris. So the reason why he says all these negative things about politics is because he believes that this is petty bullshit politics. Excuse my language. Bullshit politics. It's not politics. What he wants is great politics. And he says famously, a people, an entire society is a detour of nature's detour to get 6 or 7 great men. Agar ek society is able to create 6 or 7 great men, the whole of society is just a detour of nature to create those few great individuals. He says the time for petty politics is over. The very next century will bring the fight for the domination of the earth, the compulsion to great politics. The new philosopher can arise only in conjunction with a ruling caste as its highest spiritualization. Great politics, rule of the earth are at hand. So he thought he was the prophet of a new kind of great new politics. Great politics, he thought, was the politics of the empires of Rome, Athens, Alexander, Julius Caesar, Napoleon. Nietzsche was a dogged defender of power and also of the warrior ethos. He described his work, his philosophy, as assassination attempts. Yes, I am trying to assassinate these people. And he called himself the apostle of active nihilism. So you see, Nietzsche is not some kitten. He is ferocious. When the truth, and now I've put some Nazi posters just for fun. Maybe you'll get the answer you were looking for. or at least you get a sense of what it was in Nietzsche that attracted the Nazis to him. When the truth enters into a fight with the lies of millennia, we shall have upheavals, a convulsion of earthquakes, the likes of which have never been dreamed of. The concept of politics will have merged entirely with a war of spirits. All power structures of the old society will have been exploded. There will be wars, the likes of which have never been seen on earth. It is only beginning with me that the earth knows great politics. This is no kitten. This is no person to say that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. No. He is the great destroyer of everything that has held mankind back. In opposition to the dwarfing and adaptation of man to a specialized utility. Chote se, you're working on this little screw and that's all you bloody know how to do. You know, you're this accounting major. Sorry if there are any accounting majors. All you know is how to add up a few things. And he says this specialized utility, a reverse movement is needed. We've got to break this down. The production of a synthetic summarizing, justifying man for whose existence the transformation of mankind into a machine is a precondition, as a base on which he can invent his higher form of being. So it's a question of mankind reinventing themselves into a higher being. A dominating race can grow up only out of terrible and violent beginnings. Oh man, you can see how that fikra probably became an anthem for Mr. You-know-who. Where are the barbarians of the 20th century? Nietzsche asks. Destroy this civilization. He's contemptuous of it. Now do you see it? No? To expect that strength will not manifest itself as strength. Sorry about that. To expect that you will think that I will come across to you like a little kitten. As the desire to overcome, to appropriate, to have enemies is every bit as absurd as to expect that weakness will manifest itself as strength. I want enemies, says Nietzsche. You should too. Yeah? Tordo, pando, kasun maro. No act of violence, rape, exploitation, destruction is intrinsically unjust, since life itself is violent, rapacious, exploitative, and destructive. Ooh. Yikes. From now on, there will be more favorable preconditions for more comprehensive forms of dominion. There will be favorable circumstances for domination, whose like has never yet existed. The possibility has been established for the production of international racial unions, whose task will be to rear a master race. The future masters of the earth, a new tremendous aristocracy based on the severest self-legislation, on which the will of philosophical men of power and artist tyrants will be made to endure for millennia. That higher party of life which would take the greatest of all tasks into its hands, the higher breeding of humanity, including the merciless extermination of everything degenerate and parasitical, would make possible again that excess of life on earth from which the Dionysian state will grow once again. Again, you see, those who argued for the elimination of people who they thought were degenerates, etc., found some justification certainly in his writing. The Superman will come and lead to the transvaluation of all values. He will be a proponent of manliness. Hello, toxic masculinity. Manliness and will. Oh, yeah, Nietzsche was big into being a man. He will lead to the restoration of a virile and, if need be, cruel Homeric aristocratic ethos that was subverted for 2,000 years by the Judeo-Christian slave revolt in ethics. We've got to go back to Homer. We've got to go back to Achilles. We've got to go back to Agamemnon. We've got to go back to Caesar and Alexander and those people who are not scared of killing a couple of thousand people to make their civilizations great. That's what reality is. That's what history is. what's that beautiful song by Leonard Cohen? It had to be a Jew, didn't it? When they said revenge, I wonder what they meant. Have you heard that song? It's a soundtrack of Natural Born Killers. Amazing song. I'll play it for you at the end. It sounds like it's a response to Nietzsche, you know. So the Superman will be beyond good and evil. Superman, who has to be a creator in good and evil, truly has first to be a destroyer and break values. Thus, the greatest evil belongs with the greatest good. For evil is man's best strength. You've got to break an egg to make an omelette. Has any omelette ever been made without breaking an egg? No. Man must grow better and more evil, thus do teach. The most evil is necessary for the Superman's best. ये क्या namby-pamby किस्म का Superman, American Superman बनाया हुआ है, who, you know, can't do anything but good and, you know, always has to tell the truth. We want a Lex Luthor. You know, that's what we want. Mankind is the mass sacrifice to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man that would be in advance. A declaration of war on the masses by higher men is needed. A doctrine is needed powerful enough to work as a breeding agent, strengthening the strong, paralyzing and destructive for the world weary. The annihilation of the decaying races, dominion over the earth as a means of producing a higher type. So we don't know whether he meant this literally or figuratively. You can take this, if you take it figuratively, you're like, hey, yeah. But if you end up taking it literally, then no, you're going to be doing pretty awful things. So Nietzsche ended up providing National Socialism, that's Nazism, with an intellectual father who had greatness, who had wit, whose style was beautiful, you know, not abominable, who was able to articulate the resentment against both monopoly capitalism and the rising proletariat working class movement, says Stephen Eichmann. Mussolini, on the other hand, says, in truth, we are relativists. We are not objectivists. We are not scientists. We believe in subjectivism and relativism par excellence. And the moment relativism linked up with Nietzsche and with his will to power was when Italian fascism became, as it still is, the most magnificent creation of an individual and a national will to power. Now you see that this is not some conspiracy theory. They really did think that fascism was the manifestation of a will to power for that nation. Goebbels, the year 1789 is hereby erased from history, he said in 1933 when Hitler came to have complete power. What does he mean by that, Ahmed? What's 1789? Yes? The French Revolution. Ahmed? Zoned out, my friend. So the fascists see themselves as having buried the egalitarian, rationalist impulses of the French Revolution. Should we stop here? I think we kind of have to. Next, we will figure out the influence that Nietzsche has on France, existentialism, postmodernism, and so on. Thank you. Yes.